Hello, everyone. It's the Historical Gamer. You can call me Matt, and today we're back for episode 12 of the Single Malt Strategy podcast. Today we have a guest. It's actually our first guest on the channel. I am inviting TortugaPower from the TortugaPower YouTube channel to join us for episode 12. How are you doing today, Tortuga?
Oh, I'm doing really good. How you doing, Matt?
Doing great. Thanks for coming on. I know we kind of scheduled this last minute. We were debating something pretty vigorously today at on your Discord chat, and Jean couldn't make it on such short notice, but glad to have you. Glad to have the first guest on the channel, and I think we've got a really good episode ahead of us. So once again, thanks for coming on. But I guess the first thing that we usually lead off our podcast with is just kind of seeing what have you been up to lately? What have you been playing? I know you run a YouTube channel that looks a lot at strategy games as well. I know you're a big Aurora 4X player, but not to steal any of your thunder, what have you been working on lately?
Yeah, definitely a lot of the Aurora 4X, because that's a blast of a game, but if it had a better user interface, I think we'd attract more people to it. But also, I'm, of course, trying to prep for the To End All Wars series that you and I may eventually have upcoming here.
Yeah, I need to learn Age-Odd games better. I've run a small series of that myself, but it's one of those things where it's like, yes, I want to do this. We're going to, for those of you who don't know, XTRG and myself are going, or not XTRG, good lord, Tortuga and myself are going to be playing XTRG in a game of To End All Wars. So I'm looking forward to that. It's just a matter of making sure he doesn't wipe the carpet with us and making sure you don't sign any treaties behind my back and hang me out to dry.
Yeah, well, if it comes down to that, we may have to negotiate something with him. But really, I'm also doing the same thing, just practicing that and trying to make sure that it's not a total steamroll. We already joked that we're going to hold our defensive lines, like, respectively, like 2/3 the way through our countries already. So that's not a good sign.
Well, for Russia, that's just an effective tactic. Then you suck them in and wait for winter. But
yeah, probably not the best idea for France.
But anyway, so a bit of Aurora, a bit of To End All Wars. Anything else on your boat lately, or just mainly those two games?
I have a new series of Rule the Waves coming up now, so now I'm prepping for that, and that should be a lot of fun.
Awesome.
What about you?
Well, I've been playing a bit of, trying to even think and remember what I've been playing a bit of lately. So I've been playing a bit of War in the Pacific, which I've just sort of yesterday announced a new series I'm going to be doing with Belugan on that. Mainly just a one-way series, but it's a play-by-email game that I have going with him. We're using a Focus Pacific mod, which, from my perspective, great. It makes the Japanese even stronger at the start of the war. But War in the Pacific, still doing some Ultimate General Civil War. I've thrown a little bit of just kind of variety in there. I've played a little bit of Crisis in the Kremlin. I don't know if you ever played the original, but there was recently a remake that was made that is now on Steam, which is pretty cool. It's a game that basically puts you in kind of Gorbachev's seat, late Soviet Union, 1985, to as far as you can make it. But it's a little bit obtuse and doesn't really tell you what's going on, so it's maybe not the best constructed game, but it's a really cool concept and is a lot of fun. And that's been mainly it. A little bit of Afghanistan 11 in there, but mainly those are the games I've been playing with. And if I ever need to not really think about a game, I generally throw in World of Warships. So just kind of a casual sort of, hey, I'm just kind of turning my brain off while I play this. Hopefully no World of Warships fans yell at me about that. But basically a first-person shooter at sea, so I feel like I don't need to think a lot, but that's probably why I'm not very good.
I have a question for you about how did you appreciate, or what was your thoughts on Afghanistan 11? Because I think I really enjoyed it and has such a unique take on the strategy gaming genre that, well, I'm just curious what you thought about it.
I have enjoyed it quite a bit. I haven't played it as much on my channel as I would like because I've been really busy and I've just haven't gotten around to pushing out as much as I would like, but I've really enjoyed it. I think it really expands upon Vietnam 65, which is kind of its predecessor game, quite effectively, and it does so in a way that feels authentic. I've actually had a couple discussions with a few people who are also in the Discord chats that we both frequent about it, and one of them is an analyst who used to do some writing for the State Department on Afghanistan. His perspective is he enjoys it. He's not quite sure how realistically it models sort of the Afghan tribal relationships. For example, in this game, you build infrastructure, and that makes the people like you. But he threw an example of it wasn't uncommon for elders to say, "Yeah, build this aqueduct right here," and they would do so intentionally so that it would run through some other guy's farmland who was a competitor and ruin his crops, and then that guy would get pissed off and go join the Taliban. And then, so it wasn't, I guess it certainly oversimplifies a very complicated conflict, but as a game, I think it's brilliant. I think it's well-balanced, well put together, very challenging, and approaches warfare in a way that not many games do. You don't see a lot of games that are focusing on counterinsurgency. You don't see a lot of games that are focusing on winning the hearts and minds of the people that you're surrounding yourself with. Most games are go out and destroy the enemy. And frankly, in this game, that kind of an approach is more often than not going to lead you to chasing your tail, running out of money, and not really accomplishing a whole lot. To me, it's almost like when you find the enemy, you destroy them, but you're not going out there and hunting for them. You're going out there and trying to, connect with the villagers, build infrastructure, ensure that the roads are free of IEDs, and then when you do run across the enemy, then you go ahead and you take him out. But it's almost, it's not core to your objective. Not that it's not important, it's just not the principal thing you're going out there and trying to do. At least that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I think that pretty accurately describes it. I think we'll be talking more about this in a second, but the game designed to reset and not do your typical Army A versus Army B. I know that they had the predecessor, Vietnam 65, to build off of, but that game and this game, they really stand out. I don't know many other games who do this asymmetric warfare at all, and I was very impressed by it myself.
Yeah, if you listen to Bruce Garrick's podcast, Wild Weasel, or if you listen to, occasionally they'll talk about it in 3 Moves Ahead, which is kind of this big strategy game podcast, they'll talk about asymmetric warfare in games, but it's almost always, with the exception, I think, of Vietnam 65 and Afghanistan 11, all of the games they typically reference are board games. So there's a whole, coin counterinsurgency board game series. But when it comes to PC, you're absolutely right. Vietnam 65 and Afghanistan 11 are really the only 2 PC games that I can think of off the top of my head. I don't know if they ever made a PC version of Fire in the Lake. I'm not sure. But really, those are the 2 PC games that focus on counterinsurgency, which is really neat. Because, earlier today, we were actually having a discussion on your Discord about what makes a good game. And needless to say, I don't think we got along, totally perfectly in our discussion. I think we may have different viewpoints. So I think really that's what the topic of this podcast is really going to be: what makes a good game. And hopefully we can battle it out, and I can beat you down with your own words, and we can leave you dazed and confused and not sure what's going on. So
I can always practice.
What's that? Wait a minute. What is that?
I don't know if that was intentional, but that was beautiful. I will probably try not to stick to the able French tactic of retreating or surrendering in this battle royale.
Anyway, so so hopefully you don't get yourself run over, but we'll see. So I guess we'll shift over that way and say, in your opinion, within the vein of strategy or war game, but I know you play a lot of strategy games as well that wouldn't be classified just as war games. What is really important to you? Like, what are some of your favorite war games, and what about those games makes them so good in your eyes? Like, what is the best element to, I guess, what makes a good war game or good game, period?
Obviously a very difficult question to answer. I guess starting off with at least some of the good games. I think in the past 10 years or so, the games that have struck me the most are ones like Hearts of Iron 3, Advanced Tactics Gold. I was really very pleasantly surprised with Command Ops 2. And I don't know which Gary Grigsby I'd want to pick, probably War in the East. Those are, I guess, 4 examples of really good games, in my opinion. And what do those have in common? That's a good question. I would say that, like, to kind of jump the gun on one thing, the original design philosophy of any of these games is just irrelevant to me. I don't really care how they got to be where they are. I am very appreciative of games that are patched well. So I really appreciate it if a game is, if it's out of the gates a little bit buggy, like Hearts-Iron 3 was, but Paradox or whatever the developer, they pay attention to it and give it the love it needs to return it back to a stable and even expand upon it. That's something which makes a really good game for me. I would say that my definition of a good game is probably, is it something that can stand the test of time? As in, I'm playing Aurora 4X, which is some game from the early 2000s, and it's a terrible interface. But why am I playing it? Well, it's a good game. It doesn't need the interface. It has the good game mechanics which keep you interested. And maybe the question I always ask if it's a good game, could I go to a deserted island with only this game and play it for 10 years with no other games and not get bored of it? So that'll start us off. What do you think?
See, I mean, I think the crux of our debate and discussion was creative intent and the design of the game. Does it accomplish what it sets out to do? And in my mind, that's important. I think a game can be good by accident, if you will. If the design is a mess, if they're not really sure what they're trying to do, it is still possible to create a good game. But I think those games are much rarer than you would think. And it's not to say that, a well-designed game can't be bad, but in my mind, a good game, obviously it has to hold your interest, right? It has to be something that, you don't just pick up, play for an hour and a half, and then get bored of. So yeah, there is that, can you go to a desert island and can you play this game? But I also think there's an element of, what is the story this kind of game is trying to tell? Because to me, when I play a game, I'm thinking about what is the story behind the game? What is the overall lesson the game is trying to teach me? Which I think we may have a different approach to playing a game. I mean, I'm not picking up a game and just kind of, thinking about just the fun factor. That's certainly a piece to it. But to me, when I look at games, I almost look at them like books. I pick up the game, I play it for a bit, and I kind of analyze what is this game trying to get across? And I think most games are trying to get across a point. War in the Pacific, I think, it may not be the best World War II game of all time, but it is close. And when I play that game, I can see the way the game is designed, the way that it is set up, and the way that it executes itself is basically, it's a war game about logistics. In my mind, when I play that game, I see the designers are saying, here is the logistical challenge of fighting a war from both sides in the Pacific. The war is not about the battles themselves. It's not about 100 B7 or not B17s, 100 B29s bombing this Japanese factory. That's a piece to it, but it all comes back down to being able to get the right men, the right material, the right equipment in the right places to win. And at the end of the day, that's what that game is about, and that's what that war was about. So the reason I think it's a great game is, from a historical perspective, it models history, and I think it does so in an authentic manner. I don't think it's realistic in the sense that it's kind of trying to claim your not Eisenhower, but it's kind of trying to claim your Nimitz or something like that. But you're really the super Nimitz, and your super Nimitz who decides to dabble in the brigade, division, corps and army level of everything, right? Like, you're in charge of down to battalion level or down to air group level, which, like, Nimitz doesn't bother himself with that. So what I really think is important, though, is the fact that it communicates the importance of logistics, and that's, to me, why it's a great game, is because at the end of the day, what was Gary Grigsby trying to do? What was the story he was trying to what was the story he was trying to explain as he created this game? And in my mind, it was very authentic to the end goal. Maybe I'm seeing what I want to see in it, but in my mind, that is important. And I that's just kind of how I think about games. I think we had a debate about Hearts of Iron. I know you said Hearts of Iron 3 was one of your favorite games of all time. I didn't put a ton of hours into it because when I came to the game, it was very difficult for me to get into. The user interface seemed a little bit like a mess. There were like a million clicks to find out and do whatever I wanted to do. And at the end of the day, it seemed to me like it was trying to say, you are FDR, you are FDR/Eisenhower/Marshall. And it felt almost like it was delving. It focused too much at the top level, but then it focused too much at the bottom level. It didn't seem like it was a game about logistics like War in the Pacific, which is why that kind of a game I give a pass for going down into minutia because of the way that you have to model logistics. But it also didn't really seem like it was trying to. It wanted you to be too many different hats at once without telling a clear narrative of why. It almost seemed like it just wanted all this detail for detail's sake, and that's why I actually really enjoyed Hearts of Iron 4, because to me it seemed more authentic of you being, this top-level commander, you being this, basically general-in-chief, and yeah, you would concern yourself with the minutia of how many guns am I going to make, but you probably wouldn't concern yourself with, does the 15th Brigade, need to move in on the right flank, supported by the 31st, Brigade on the left flank. Like, it picked its battles on where it wanted to be extremely detailed, and I appreciated that.
Yeah,
I'll give you a chance to respond.
It's probably a fair point about Hearts of Iron 3 is that it was too ambitious. So when I look at the games, I mean, if we even just compare Hearts of Iron 3, Hearts of Iron 4, I don't mind a game which really tries to go for too much and overwhelms the user. I also think that your little point about the story, maybe I don't look for the story the developers are trying to put me on. I generally just try to find my own story, which is why I'm very comfortable in sandbox games. So that might be a difference between us. But for Hearts of Iron 3, I really appreciate the fact that you could do all those things. I don't mind that the game is extremely difficult to learn. That's just one thing, I guess, about me that I really, if you give me the opportunity to basically be Patton in the field, commanding like an army, which you could do in Hearts of Iron 3, the regions were so small that you practically had tactical combat on the strategic map. And I think that was overwhelming, especially the order of battle was kind of a nightmare to deal with. But other than those, the order of battle and, I mean, the fact that you had all the different research technologies, such detail in all the different technologies you could research. You had basically 4 technologies for any one type of infantry or ground force, armor, mechanized, etc. I really like that all these things played together into a picture, which kind of overwhelming, but in my opinion, it was more immersive. You feel like these are all the knobs that any given country in World War II actually had to play with. And yeah, there's so many because the world is a complex place. But I really appreciate the fact that they tried to throw all those knobs into one game, which maybe it didn't work out as well, at least at the release, as everyone was hoping. But I think especially by their finest hour, the last expansion, that's probably, I mean, that's definitely a game I could bring to a deserted island and play for a very long time.
But could you play it for a very long time because it's actually a good game, or could you play it for a very long time because it would take you 5 years of your life to figure out?
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah, and also the games in there run forever because, you're moving like 1 hour at a time and you're going through a huge war. Yeah, there's a lot of, I know, those are all fair points.
I mean, I may be hypocritical because I just said how much I loved War in the Pacific, but I guess to me the narrative matters, and I know it may not as much to you and you're a bigger fan of sandbox games, but I'm going to throw a different game out here that has nothing to do with war games. Tropico. Tropico is a series that I've enjoyed since I was like 13 or something like that when the first one came out. And outside of their bizarre attempt to make a pirate game, it's been a pretty good series, and it's more or less a sandbox, right? It's a city builder, and it places you in the vein of a dictator of a small Caribbean island. And it's more or less outside of that, pretty open-ended. So it gives you a lot of choices and gives you a lot of freedom to choose your game. But at the end of the day, it's telling you a story of, okay, imagine you were a dictator of a small Caribbean island. What are the choices that you would have to make if you were going to micromanage your people the way a lot of these, a lot of dictators probably do? And, how are you going to ensure your people, if they don't love you, that they maintain peace and order underneath the jackboot of your tyranny. It does so in a very playful way, but it always knows what it is. It always knows what it's trying to accomplish. And what I see with War in the Pacific, and one of the reasons I really enjoy it, is I understand what this is about. I understand what it's trying to accomplish, and therefore I can understand and accept the minutia that it provides. I don't see that in Hearts of Iron 3 personally. Again, I may have given up on it too soon before I really got a full grasp of the game. But to me, Hearts of Iron 3 is almost hey, it's a World War II game, guys, and let's throw this in here, and let's throw that in here, and let's just keep throwing stuff in the box and keep hitting you over the head with a whole bunch of different dials and buttons and things you can do without any real clear direction. And I guess the reason I always come back to creative intent is not because, you can't have a good game without good game design, but because, in my opinion, to be able to really, and this is just me, to really be able to immerse you in the game, to really be able to get you to understand, what the game is doing, you need to understand what it's trying to do. And again, maybe that's a difference between more of a purely sandbox type, mindset of let's see all the bells and whistles that we can touch and turn and do whatever just for the sake of touching and turning and doing whatever. And, my mindset where it's like, I get that you can do that in Hearts of Iron 3, but I also don't see the rationale behind making me click 80 million different buttons just to progress a couple weeks in a war without being overrun.
Okay, well, let's get to the question. I think I already kind of prepped you with this one because you didn't answer it in the Discord, but let's return to this one analogy then, because you think creative design is important, and I actually just completely disagree. And I think that basically whatever game is finished, I don't really care how the design process went. I don't really care what the developers originally intended for it. I only really care what the final product is. And this might be related to the fact that I don't really follow the narrative the developer had in mind. I usually go with my own narrative. But if we wanted to look at a game, let's just pretend that Mattel or whoever owns Barbie right now tried to make a Barbie game. This is a ridiculous example, I know, but
especially
if they try
for
to make
a podcast, what the heck are we talking
Here
about?
we go. It's intentionally ridiculous, but let's pretend that Mattel tried to make a Barbie game.
Okay.
And their developers were just horrible developers. And what they ended up making, just for completely unknown reason, is the best World War II game out there. Like something which combined all the best parts of Ajod and Paradox and Gary Grigsby into one fantastic masterpiece about World War II. I don't care that this was originally supposed to be a Barbie game because I only judge the final product. And that example was kind of like, okay, it's ridiculous intentionally.
Still trying to understand where the Barbie piece comes in, but okay, I'm hearing you out.
Yeah, it's just let's pretend a game developer had no intention of making the final product that they made, but the final product ended up being like fantastic, a magnum opus. What would you say about that game? Would you intentionally not like it because you didn't understand the narrative of the game, or like this might separate our two viewpoints on this?
I have a hard time seeing that ever being the case, I guess is my point. My point is not that, creative design is the end-all, be-all and is the only thing that matters. But my point is more that I don't think you can truly have a successful game, a coherent game, if the design that the game developers put out there doesn't in some way effectively tell the story they were trying to tell. And I think that's true even in a sandbox game. So if you're trying to be a World War II game and you're trying to, I don't know, say you're a grand strategy game of the Western Front in World War II, and you just keep throwing all these different things. Like, oh, wait a minute, there were Tiger tanks, and there were Panther tanks, and there were fighters, and there were jets, and let's keep throwing all these things in here, and you could change the way that your brigade, its formation as it moves forward, but you can also change the structure at the core level, and there's supply trucks. Like, if you just throw all that stuff into a box and it's not telling a coherent story, I don't think it can be a good game because I don't think those parts will all work together, and I don't think it will make a lot of sense. I think, for example, I'm going to use Rule the Waves because it's a game that I really enjoy. We did a co-stream of it, where we played as France, and we kept passing off control of France. But my biggest issues with Rule the Waves is it wasn't always clear why the game did the things that it did. So, for example, that was a game I thought it abstracted certain things that didn't make a ton of sense, and it led to a bunch of detail without any real feedback mechanics, which I thought was also a little bit bizarre. So when you're designing your ship, when the ship performs in combat, it's often very difficult to understand what went well, what with the design worked, what didn't work. You're almost left guessing because the combat occurs so quickly. Even if you play it slow, it's not always clear, like, all right, did I fail because I had too many 5-inch guns and I should have gone with 8-inch guns, or what? It's a lot of, all right, kind of trying to piece things together without any real clear feedback loop. Whereas like in the strategy map, if you're invading an island, and this I know this just because the rulebook says it, if you're invading an island and you can invade this island because you got a preponderance of naval forces around there, it doesn't really tell me. So it's kind of like the land forces are moving on their own, but there's no real, like, does the fleet have to escort these ships, or is it just kind of this amalgamous fleet around here? Like, why are these ships engaging in combat? Why are they sometimes not? Why can't I tell my fleet to go out and engage the enemy? It's all just kind of random. Like, you provide so much level of detail in one piece of the game, but then you claim to be an admiral commander, and yet you're supreme sea lord, and yet you don't have the ability to give any orders to the fleet other than where they're located. You can't issue directives. Like, it doesn't make sense to me that you'd be the first Sea Lord in charge of locating all of the fleets, in charge of setting submarine policy, and also in charge of designing the detail of the ships, with no clear feedback loop for the ships and no clear ability to initiate any kind of wartime strategy. And yet it gives you the level of detail and feedback in other parts of the game. I guess I'm kind of rambling and not making a coherent sense, but I think you can kind of get what I'm trying to say is the design there, the flaw in the game is the pieces that it decides to abstract seem arbitrary. And I think that's a design issue. I think that's because they took Steam and Iron, this kind of war game battle simulator, and they bolted on a strategy element, and I don't think the two mesh well together. I understand what the developer's trying to do, but I don't think he does a good enough job of tying an existing mechanic together with his new mechanic so that it really addresses the end objective of what he's trying to accomplish.
Well, I don't think you'll actually get much argument from me there about Rule the Waves. I do think that the game was basically a strategic shell strapped onto Steam and Iron, and that's even some of my grievance with it, that they don't have an auto-resolve button for the strategic mode, but I think that that's actually necessary because the game is actually better on the strategic elements a lot of the times with the ship design and all that. But if you wanted to, let me just play devil's advocate. When these people were actually around in the early 1900s, when you had Jackie Fisher, what were his feedback loops that he had? Like, maybe the Rule of the Waves developer would just say that this is realistic, that you don't really have a feedback loop, that you can only just judge based on how well their ships do sinking other ships, but you don't have the battlefield results that something more detailed that's a game mechanic, because maybe they didn't have that either.
I was thinking about that as I was saying what I was saying, and I think I still hold my stance, because you're right. It wasn't real time, right? You didn't have someone reporting back saying, those 6-inch guns are working really well in the middle of the battle. So I think that's fair. But I think the game needs some kind of mechanic to say what worked well at a summary level. Admirals did figure out during the Russo-Japanese War, wait a minute, these heavy guns are doing the preponderance of the hitting. These light guns aren't coming into action. The engagement ranges are too long. Let's make more heavy-gunned warships. Like, there was that level of naval advisors who saw the battles, who witnessed the battles, who wrote about the battles after the fact, were able to provide information about what was working and what wasn't, which, I mean, admittedly, Dreadnought was probably going to happen one way or another based on naval theory, but was really able to inform that it was a valid theory. So I think, there needs to be some kind of mechanic, even if the game delays it, or if it's just a summary report after the battle of, like, here's how many heavy caliber shells were fired, here's how many heavy caliber shells hit, here's the damage that the heavy caliber shells. There is a way you could design a mechanic to say, if you're really just trying to say this is realistic because there was not a lot of information, well, there wasn't a lot of information until they stopped and looked at the results and studied the results. But at that point, there was information to go on. And that did influence future ship design. And that would be kind of my critique, is that that's not really true, is that they did get information.
Yeah, I guess you are right, too. And I think you aren't given the same amount of information that realistically they would have been given. We don't have access to those. And, we won't have an engineer analyzing the damage you have to your own ship in order to improve armor or to improve, okay, we could use just a little bit more belt armor here or whatnot.
Right.
That's a pretty fair point.
And I would say for look at War in the Pacific. I know Dr. Zayas or whatever had a quick little remark in the chat saying, do I like War in the Pacific? Is it a game about logistics because it's a poorly modeled game looking at the Pacific theater, which I don't subscribe to, but I will say this. War in the Pacific doesn't give you the option to customize your ships, and you could say, well, it doesn't do that for the Allies or the Japanese, but it could do that for the Japanese, because in the Japanese side of things, you're actually handling production, you're handling resourcing, you're handling oil. Why wouldn't you be able to potentially design ships for the Japanese Navy that might not come into service in 1944 or 1945? That would be a quote-unquote realistic thing that you could do. But it's not trying to model ship design or War in the Pacific. It's trying to model, at the end of the day, the reason that includes a lot of these statistics is because it's trying to model logistics. It abstracts a lot of the combat in War in the Pacific. I think one of the big criticisms that a lot of people have in War in the Pacific is they say, well, the air combat model is flawed. It doesn't give you enough information back about air combat, or the naval combat model is flawed, which very may well be true. Just kind of you see ships line up on each side of this map and they take turns exchanging fire. And that's true. A lot of that's abstract, doesn't make a lot of sense for a game of that detail. But the reason that it works in my book is because it's not really about the combat. It's not really about the air combat, the naval combat, the land combat. These models are not terribly well put together, so I will critique the game in that sense, but it doesn't detract from what the game is trying to do. And the game is trying to tell the story about, how do you fight a Pacific theater campaign? And at the end of the day, it's really about getting resources from point A to point B so that you can support your offensive and have enough manpower and naval power and whatnot to move forward. And it does that in a very detailed way, but there are parts of the game that it abstracts, and the parts of the game that it abstracts make sense for what the game is trying to accomplish and what the game is trying to convey. And that's why it works in my mind. In Hearts of Iron 3, I don't get that same sense of why am I doing this, other than it just seems like someone put a bunch of features into a box and said, here, have fun, guys, which, again, maybe that just goes more to my mindset of it, sandbox versus not sandbox, is that, okay, maybe that is the right approach. I don't know, but for me, it can't be considered a great game because there's no coherence behind the decisions that they have to include certain things and exclude others.
Okay, well, you've used War in the Pacific as an example of a great game. I haven't played it, so I do naively agree. It looks like an amazing game. I don't know if I'll get into it anytime soon because it also looks really complicated. But if it wasn't War in the Pacific, if that game didn't exist, what would be another game that you would say masters this game design? That's it.
Is going to get torn apart by you for this. Is it bad if I say Hearts of Iron 4 does a really good job of this?
Well, let's hear your reasoning first.
My rationale behind this is because at the end of the day, what is Hearts of Iron 4 trying to convey? It's trying to convey that you are, in my view, it's trying to convey that you are Eisenhower or you are FDR. And I think the marketing on the box does that too, right? Like it has Stalin and FDR and or not box, but digital thumbnail, whatever. It essentially is trying to say like you are the supreme commander. And the reason I think Hearts of Iron 4, I keep going back to War in the Pacific, the reason I think Hearts of Iron 4 makes sense is because it concerns you with things that would concern the leader of the country. I do think industrial production is very valid for a political leader back home. If you're FDR, a lot of your decision-making is going to involve approving not approving contracts directly, but approving initiatives and production and things like that, building the tools of war. What it's not going to concern you with is, how is my core constructed? How is my, it does a little bit of this. It gives you a little bit of, how do you construct a division or whatnot? What are the elements there? But it doesn't concern you with the tactical battle, which it excludes you from, which I'm fine with, and I think makes sense given what it's trying to do, that it excludes these components. I know people say, oh, well, the game's too streamlined. Well, it makes a lot more coherent sense if it's trying to be a top-down strategic game where you're the head person in charge. Why the heck do I have to worry about brigades and whatnot engaging and flanking and all of that? Those are two different games in my mind. They could be both, I suppose, but I just don't see. My main criticism of Hearts of Iron 3 is that it tries to do too much without a coherent strategy. Hearts of Iron 4, in my mind, maybe it doesn't do enough, but I think it does it more coherently, and it makes sense of what it's trying to accomplish and what it abstracts. And I can see that and understand, okay, this is why it doesn't do this, this is why it does that, and it makes sense to me.
Okay, so I understand. I think I understand why you would like Hearts of Iron 4 more, from your wanting a story to be told type thing, because I think in Hearts of Iron 4 you can kind of just put everything onto AI and the game runs itself, right? You can just set 2 orders on the front, and this is a joke somebody made, that you can do 2 orders to expand as hungry and conquer the world while you're eating lunch or something, So I understand that this does make for a nice narrative, like, oh, I was hungry, I was also hungry for lunch. But anyway, I expanded my borders and I conquered the world. And I didn't have to get into the minutia of the order of battle system was a disaster in Hearts of Iron 3. However, I just don't care about that as much as I care about feeling immersed in an environment which feels like World War II. And for me, I really appreciate in Hearts of Iron 3 that you had the very small regions that you could give the flanking commands to. Basically, you almost had tactical combat, so you could do the unit surrounds. You could, let's pin this region and move around with my armor, or Schwerpunkt with the infantry here, and then push through Blitzkrieg with the tanks. I don't know. I think in Hearts of Iron 4, they took a step back from that a little bit, and they just said, you're not doing the individual commands. You're not Patton. You're not anybody smaller than Patton. You are like the Eisenhower, like you said. But I just think that the more you can throw into a World War II game, if I could Rule the Waves, not Rule the Waves, Rome Total War, if I could go into the actual tactical battles with squad and company-sized forces and fight the little battles on the map, that to me would even add more to a game. I think that that's impossible to do, and we learned that with Spore. I think Spore was just trying to do way too much. It was trying to be 4 games in one, and we saw the development fail. But I still think that if that game had been successful, it would have been one of my favorites of all time. And that's probably the reason why I like Hearts of Iron 3 more than Hearts of Iron 4.
Yeah, I can understand where you're coming from. I guess to me, it doesn't really... What I'm hearing a bit of is, I just want everything in the box and I can pick and choose, and you're doing a good job of playing Jean's role. Anyway, so, Jean is very much of the same mindset of give me all the tools and let me kind of almost play the game I want to play and immerse myself in the game that I want to immerse myself with.
Yeah, I guess I am just standing in for Jean, aren't I?
Well, but on that sense, I guess I'd be more okay with that if I felt like the game was constructed in a way that made sense and wasn't just piling more tools in the tool chest without any organization to it. My concern is that a lot of games, and Hearts of Iron 3 may not be the best example, but a lot of games throw every little piece and nook and cranny into the game just so they can say you have it, and not in a way that makes any real clear sense. If you're going to include a feature, there needs to be a clear reason why, and not just because we want to say we have Division Crafter 2.0. It needs to have some level of narrative behind the rationale for it being there. That's my view. I guess I'm trying to think of another good example of a game that does this. And I guess one game I'd come across is one series I'd come across with is the Total War series. So the Total War series has a grand strategy game that's somewhat abstract, and then it has you actually fighting the battles on the battlefield, or it gives you the option to fight battles on the battlefield. So you have this grand strategy map, you send armies out, you build them up, you send them out, and they fight. And to me, what that game is really trying to convey, what those games are really trying to convey, is your entire strategic map is set up to enable your tactical battles. So it makes sense of them delving into certain levels of grand strategy management without getting into too much minutia. It's pretty abstract on the strategy map. You build a few buildings here, it allows you to build these, different units, but really at the end of the day, it all comes down to you building your army and building an empire that enables you to craft your own army to fight other armies. But it's really a game about army movement and army combat, with the strategy element supporting that. And I see that in a lot of times, some of their games, they don't work very well, but it does make sense of what they're trying to accomplish. They're not trying to really tell you about an empire management game, other than the way that it addresses how combat occurs and is resolved. That's kind of my view of it. Total War may be a bad example because I'm not sure they've done a great job recently. But to me, that's a game that's kind of doing the same thing, where they're saying we're not giving you all the level of detail. You're not setting specific tax rates in your provinces. You can make them generally high, medium, low, because at the end of the day, what it's really about is building armies and fighting battles.
I think you make a very good point here, because I also am a fan of at least the earlier Total War games. And I think you're right that part of the success of that game has to be because they focus so much on having good tactical battles, and the strategic element they left just compelling enough, but not too deep as to overwhelm you. You can maybe even make like a signal to noise ratio argument here, that if you have too much of the strategic, it takes away from the enjoyment of the tactical, because you're not, focused on the tactical as much. So I think this is a really good point. Having the focus spread too thin can be a bad thing. Although I don't see it in Hearthfire 3, it probably also exists there.
Maybe it's just me, because it was one of those games that I tried to play and it bounced off of me, because again, it was just so difficult to get into, and I didn't see the logic behind some of the decisions they made. It very may well have been on my end where it didn't resonate with me, but that was the biggest stumbling block, was for me to see all of this stuff and really not be able to grasp what's the point. And I think another good example of a game that I think does a good job of it provides a lot of minutia, but within a very narrow framework, is the combat mission games. I played a lot more of them in the early days. I haven't played with them as much lately. But the combat mission games, basically, what are they trying to do? They're trying to put you in the role, at the end of the day, of a battalion commander, fighting a battle or a series of closely linked battles in like an operation. With a very narrow scope. They're not trying to, march you across all of Western Europe. The scenarios span Western Europe, for example, in Barbarossa to Berlin, or the new Normandy one just looks at Normandy. But they're not trying to say, take this one unit or take a series of units and march across Western Europe. They're saying, all right, you've got these units in battle. Now go fight a tactical battle with all the intricate detail and nuances that uncovers. But at the end of the day, that battle you're fighting, it's about that one place on that map. It's about that one narrow area. It's not about the divisions fighting around you. It's not about your brigade CO or your supply officer. You're a battalion commander. And I know there's various size scenarios, but really it maxes out at like an overstrength battalion. You're a battalion commander thrown into a battlefield. It gives you a set of challenges. You have to overcome those challenges, and everything they include is relevant to that challenge, to that decision of how you're going to play this game. And you can create battles all you want. There's a sandbox element to it, but it's all within that narrow construct of this game is about infantry combat, roughly at the battalion level, on the battlefield, And it includes a lot of intricate detail, but it all ties back to that overarching objective.
I see. So in your opinion, like command missions what's this narrative that they're saying? You're just following a small unit through World War II?
No, you're following through one battle or one small operation. So they're saying, imagine you're a battalion commander in this scenario. Go, accomplish your objective. It's not you're, trying to get a small group of troops across all of Western Europe throughout the war. It's really saying you're being plopped into a battlefield with a specific tactical challenge that you have to overcome. So the narrative is you're an infantry battalion commander in World War II in this battle. And the narrative is basically forces you to overcome the challenges that an infantry commander would in that scenario. It doesn't expand the scope beyond you being a very specific role within a battle and giving you the challenges that are relevant to that role. It doesn't make you the division CO when you have to, assign air tasking or whatever. You're given the constraints of what that leader would have. I'll use another example. Scourge of War. Have you played Scourge of War at all?
No, I'm familiar with it, but I've never played it.
So I'm going to use the Take Command series initially, but the Take Command series, what it does best in my view, which is kind of the predecessor, it puts you into the role of a specific commander in a Civil War battle. So you're playing Second Bull Run, and it's a scenario-driven game, so it's not sandbox per se, but it puts you into the role of one specific character in a battle. There could be a wider battle going on around you, but at the end of the day, you're in charge of one unit. It could be a division, it could be a brigade, it could be a corps, it could be the whole army. And you're given a task, a series of orders, a series of objectives, and your objective is to accomplish that. There's a lot going on around you, but at the end of the day, your objective is to accomplish your orders. And so it's telling you, what is it like? The narrative is, you're a brigade commander at the Battle of Second Manassas. And that's the narrative. What are you going to do? What are the challenges you have to overcome? Or you're a division commander at Second Manassas. What does it mean to be a division commander? What do you have to worry about as a division commander? And how are you going to overcome that? And as the scope of the battle increases, as your role increases, the responsibilities that fall back on you do increase proportionally to what they would actually be in the Civil War in that role. But if you're a brigade commander, you're not concerned about commanding army units or anything like that. You're concerned with specifically what you're trying to accomplish. Another good example in my view is Falcon 4.0. You're a fighter pilot in a hypothetical Korean conflict. You can do a little bit of manipulating to the game. You can, do some tasking of missions, change your ordnance, things like that are definitely outside the scope of what a fighter pilot would actually do. But you're not telling an infantry division on the other side of the front that it needs to switch to attack mode rather than defensive mode. Because at the end of the day, the narrative it's trying to tell you is you're a fighter pilot in this massive war that's going on around you, and, what is it like to be in that scenario? It doesn't also make you Division Commander 2.0 and tell you to charge an armored brigade across the DMZ.
All right, well, I have a question for you about combat mission that I think may differentiate us, our viewpoints on game design.
Okay.
If combat mission was done in a skirmish mode where you were just plopped into a random map and random enemies, would it be as compelling of a game for you?
As compelling? No, because I do think if you're a battalion commander, it gives you some context. So, you understand a little bit of what's going on around you. So to be able to set up a hypothetical or a real-world battle around, real-world history, to me, makes some sense.
Okay, well, what if you traded the, historical framework, though, for a game which had much higher replayability? Because if you're just randomly generating scenarios, let's imagine they're still compelling scenarios on the same wavelength as combat missions campaign mode, but would you still think that the sacrifice for replayability wasn't worth it because you lost this narrative?
I guess I don't. I think we're looking at narrative two different ways. I'm not saying a crafted scenario is required for there to be a narrative. So the specific scenarios that are built in the battle, there is still a skirmish mode. I think the game would be a little bit less appealing if you removed all these crafted scenarios, but I think that would just be more because now I've got to do the work to go and create a scenario. At the end of the day, the narrative the game is trying to come across is you're a battalion commander in whatever battle you're fighting, and you have to accomplish your objective, which is generally get to the other side of the map, hold this point, destroy the enemy units. And that all stays the same if everything is sandboxed and randomly generated and everything like that. I think it would still be a very good game. I do enjoy the story that's built up around, the briefings, and you can kind of put yourself in the shoe of like, all right, what would it have been like to be a battalion commander at Bastogne or during Operation Cobra in Normandy. But I think the core narrative that I'm really talking about is not just the narrative around the scenario. It's the narrative around the experience that you're trying to convey. And to me, the experience you're trying to convey is being a battalion commander.
Okay, so you would say that this experience would even exist even if it was only skirmish mode. So what you're saying about a game like Hearts of Iron 3 is that it just doesn't exist at all there.
I don't understand what am I trying to do? And I guess to me it seems like it's a good example of a game that throws a million tools into the box without a clear explanation of like what's my role in all of this. And maybe again, this may just be me. I always enjoy games that, or not always, but in general I enjoy games that put you into a bigger world. I think my issue with Rule the Waves is some of the decisions you have is it doesn't make sense for what your role is, and some of what you can't do doesn't make sense for what your role is. And I think that tells from a design perspective. To your point earlier, they just kind of took one game and they bolted on a shell of another game to try and change what the game was about, but they're really two separate games and they don't mesh perfectly or all that well together. I still enjoy the hell out of the game, but it's to me it's flawed in that sense, and I don't see those kind of compromises being made in War in the Pacific. The decisions that are removed from your control make sense to me. The decisions that are left in your control make sense to me. It all seems very tight and well designed. Hearts of Iron is one of those games that, to me anyway, just feels like I don't know what I am. I don't feel like the game knows what it is. I feel like the game just tries to do everything without a coherent plan of attack on how it's going to do that.
I see. I'm trying to run out of things to disagree with you on, because all those things made sense.
I mean, if you want to include minutia, fine, but there needs to be a reason for it, and it needs to be more than just because you will do better. Like, I'm trying to understand why that decision matters and why it needs to be there. And I guess that's my main concern. When I come to a game, if you're going to ask me to do something, there needs to be, in my mind, I need to be able to understand what's the rationale between why I have to do something. And if I can't do something, I need to understand why it matters that I can't. Like, does it even matter that I can't do it? And in Hearts of Iron 4, what the game is trying to convey to me is that I'm Eisenhower or I'm FDR. And so I don't really care that there are pieces of the game I can't touch. Now, I understand that's problematic from a series perspective, right? Because if you absolutely loved Hearts of Iron 3 and you came to Hearts of Iron 4, it might feel like it's a completely different game. And that's, I think, more a symptom of when you get into a series and you have this construct in your mind of what a game is and what it's trying to be, and you understand that, and then it changes the ballgame on you, but it still claims to be, Hearts of Iron 4 versus Hearts of Iron 3. I understand being upset with that or being frustrated with that, because this game that you knew and understood and to you it made sense of what it was trying to accomplish is now something completely different, and yet they claim it's the same series of games, right? So
yeah, I agree.
I get that. Like, I understand that frustration. But from a purely coming at it in a vacuum perspective, I think Hearts of Iron 4 is a well-designed game and, makes a lot of clear and understandable design decisions to me that makes sense. I think War in the Pacific does the same thing. I think Combat Mission does the same thing. I think, I'm trying to think of other games that just burying you in minutia. I probably should have had a list of these, but because I don't mean to keep harping on Hearts of Iron 3. A lot of people love the game, so obviously it's not a terrible game. I'm not saying that. But I suppose this is the side effect of discussing something quickly on a text chat client, 5 hours ago, taking a 4-hour nap and then saying, let's do a podcast, and hopefully people enjoy it.
I mean, I haven't played it, but I think that War in the War in the West, Gary Grigsby's War in the West, has a lot of logistical stuff that you can really be buried in. I think they make you take over the air campaign in a much more detailed fashion that was in War in the East. So,
I mean, maybe the John Tiller games are good examples of like literally absolutely everything is modeled, and it's not done so in a way that's terribly logical to me. It's just like, let's throw all these units on a map, and let's throw a million turns at you, and let's make the game take an hour to resolve. And it's like, okay, but at some point, like, do I really need to be? Why am I telling this company or regiment to go here? I'm an army commander, right? Why can't I just tell the brigade to go here and do that? I guess that's kind of one of my criticisms of Total War, is that you're an army commander, and yet as the battles get bigger and bigger, it seems like you should have someone else that would allow you to just say, all right, select these 5 units, select this brigade, tell this brigade to move forward. It's one of the reasons I like games like Sid Meier's Gettysburg and Scourge of War, is because they do include the order of battle in those games, and it makes sense why they include it, and they give you a command interface that makes sense. Like if you're a division commander, sure, maybe it makes sense to move individual brigades around. But if you're a corps commander, telling each individual brigade where it should be posted just becomes tedious and pointless, and there's no real reason you should be doing it at the corps level. So, again, I think the John Tiller games are a good example of games that give you a ton of minutia that really isn't necessary for what you're trying to accomplish.
I really think you should check out Command Ops 2 then, because that game actually enforces the chain of command, where you give orders to, just the main reason why it's so compelling, because you don't have that many units to give orders to, is because they actually integrate the combat delay for getting orders established and all that. But they have you essentially as like a brigadier general, and you don't give orders to anything like a company or anything. You give orders to whatever is above a company, something in the middle,
like a battalion or a regiment,
yeah,
or
exactly.
something like that. Okay, yeah, I'll have to check it out. They mentioned it on the last 3 moves ahead that it was on Steam now. I think it was. You said Command Ops?
Yeah, Command Ops 2. It did just go over to Steam. I mean, the game is unfortunately another one of those which is not really easy to pick up, but well, that's just the way it is with some of these war games, I guess, until we have a better tutorial system than just searching for videos online or whatnot.
Well, I mean, and again, I enjoy War in the Pacific, which is certainly not an easy game to pick up. So I'm not saying it needs to be simple just for simplicity's sake, but I need my decisions to make sense, and I need to be able to understand why I'm being asked to make these decisions. And I think some games clearly do a better job of it than others. And that's where it all comes back to me, to creative intent. Is you want me to make a decision, that's fine. It may be difficult to understand it may be difficult because there's a lot of detail around making that decision, but as long as I understand why I'm being asked to make that decision, I'm okay with it. And I think if a game is well designed, it will clearly tell you the rationale behind the decisions that you're being forced to make. And I think that's where, again, a lot of games, if they don't do a good job of that, if they don't do a good job of clearly telling you why you have to make the decisions you have to make, or why you can't make the decisions you want to make, I think that makes it increasingly difficult for a game to be a good game. If we come back to what makes a good game, that's my view on why it needs to be well designed. You can create a good game in spite of that, but I think you're going to struggle to do that repeatably. I'll use a completely different industry example. BlackBerry made a great phone at the start of the smartphone era, for those of you who remember, the early BlackBerries. It wasn't a great phone because they were trying to design a consumer-centric device. It was a great phone in spite of that. It was because they accidentally hit on what a lot of people were looking for when that really wasn't their intent. And they gained a ton of market share. They sold a ton of phones. They thought everything was going great, but they fundamentally didn't understand. They didn't make the design decisions with that phone to be able to sustain that success. And it was a complete accident for them, to the fact that they gained 70% of the smartphone market share. And as soon as someone came along, namely Apple, who did a better job of, here's what we're trying to address. We're trying to address this consumer market. We're going to address it this way. We made these design decisions. They knew exactly why they were making those decisions so they could meet that specific need. And people saw and understood that product. As soon as they did that, BlackBerry was left in the dust because BlackBerry was making something that was successful and they didn't know why. And I think games are the same way. I think if you make a game and you're trying to do something and you do something completely different and people resonate with that, okay, great. But you're gonna really struggle to maintain that success in the next game. And that's why, in my view, design is so important, because at the end of the day, as a designer, you need to understand what you're trying to accomplish, so you understand what market you're trying to hit, which consumers, which gamers, what those gamers are looking for, so you can address that. Because if you don't, you're just shooting, blindly into the dark, and maybe you'll hit something, but it's complete luck, and it's unlikely that you're going to hit anything at all.
Well, I think I would be there to pick up the pieces of a game that just gave me the tools, like a Hearts of Iron 3. I mean, even your example with BlackBerry, it sounds like they accidentally, despite their not having the correct creative intent, made a successful phone. And it doesn't sound like they were able to continue that success because they didn't know what they were doing. But I would be the person to use that BlackBerry, even though they didn't really know what they were doing, why they made it so successful. Because in my opinion, if it's successful, then I'll use it.
Yeah, I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I think, but even look at sandbox games. I know we're probably running up a little bit against time, but if we look at a sandbox game and we say, like, okay, I'm fine if you just give me the tools, would we not agree that a sandbox game would be better if it was designed to be a sandbox game than if it was a sandbox game by mistake?
It's a good question. I think that 99% of the time, or 9 out of 10, maybe 7 out of 10, I don't know. I'm sure that you're right, that if a game is designed one way, it's better in that role. But I just don't really care how the game was designed. I myself just only look at the final product. And then if I enjoy that, then I enjoy it. And I don't really care what they were trying to do at first.
Yeah, I mean, if I enjoy the game at the end of the day, I enjoy it. And that's fair. I guess my main point is just I struggle to enjoy it if I'm being asked to make all these decisions and don't know why. And that's why I fall back on design intent, is because if you have a clear intent and you clearly execute on that intent, then it is much easier for me to understand what you're trying to do.
And I think also, if you take away from BlackBerry something from this, if you end up playing a game and if, like, you were aware of the design intent and all that, and you were aware that the final game, even though it's good, didn't match up with that, you would probably be cautious about future games because that's not likely to be a repeated success. Whereas I would naively roll into the sequel and it would be a disaster. So
there was one other interesting thing that someone posted in the chat that I think is kind of worth commenting on, is some of the problems that you see with games. I think Rome Total War is a good example. The design of the game didn't make sense. Like the battles were great, but the strategy design, the decision that you had to make around, like, all right, there's these 3 different families. In Rome Total War 1, Rome was split into 3 factions that all basically were their own independent factions that attempted to conquer the world. So the battlefield design was great. The concept was good. The build up your empire and whatnot was great, but the storytelling mechanic was a little bit flawed in that it didn't make sense. Like, I know Rome was divided at the time between these, large families with tons of power, but it didn't at all resemble what it was trying to say it resembled in the game. And so that was a major stumbling block for me to say, like, okay, I understand why you're trying to split Rome into 3 factions, but the way it was executed was just executed very poorly. So you're trying to tell the story and you do a bad job of telling it. However, the core of that game was fundamentally strong, and a ton of mods came in and made a whole bunch of different variants of, like, total conversion mods that completely changed the game, and in my mind, salvaged that game into being one of, if not the best, Total War games of all time. I think they did a better job with the expansion to Rome Total War when it came with Barbarian Invasion, because they said they told a much more coherent story, and the concrete elements to the game that were strong were still there, but they did a better job of telling that narrative. And so that expansion was better than the core game in my mind, because the narrative was better. But I do think, mods are an interesting question. Is, maybe these sandbox games like Hearts of Iron 3, if we're going to call that a sandbox game, or any game in general, a modder can come in and clean up here, you have these choices, you have these decisions you have to make in a sandbox game, and can do a better job of conveying why you have to make those decisions. And so I think in a lot of cases, a lot of these games, like Hearts of Iron 3, didn't that have a lot of mods? And a lot of people really enjoyed some of the modifications that came out with that game, and that was one of the selling pieces, is how strong the modding community was for it.
Well, I know people swear by the Black Ice mod, and probably most people who play Black Ice didn't end up getting too interested in Hearts of Iron 4. But I don't know if Hearts of Iron 3 in particular was mod heavy compared to any other game. So I can't speak to that now.
Okay. Well, I guess my point is more along the lines of that a mod does have the ability to make some of the decisions and maybe correct some of the ills of the design of a game. Because to your point, like the core mechanics of the game may be great. But if it does a poor job of conveying why those mechanics exist the way they do, then for me personally, it's going to be hard to resonate. However, I think it's possible for a modder to come in and maybe tell that in a better way and maybe get me more engaged. Because Rome Total War 1 was a great example of a game that I played through once in the core game and didn't really get it and didn't really see the brilliance that was underneath the hood. But then when some mods came in and did a better job of making some of the decisions that I had to make more sense, to me, then it became one of the best, if not the best, Total War game of all time.
That's probably a good way to summarize our differences on this. I actually really loved the initial Rome Total War without mods and even without the expansion, because it was missing the elements that you prefer. And I think this just comes down to personal preference, that I enjoyed the kind of sandbox feel to the first game, where I don't know if the narrative was compelling or if, but I really enjoyed still building up armies and smashing them against other armies. So
I enjoyed that too, but to me, that didn't change with the mods, and that didn't change with the expansion. It just made more sense of why things were flowing and existing the way that they did. Again, like Rome Total War 1 stock, still built the same army, essentially, the same way. The gameplay was still the same as the mods. But the mods did a better job of packaging that up and making the whole thing make more sense to me.
Well, Tortuga just makes his own sense of games. He relies on no sense at all.
Okay, well, that's fair, I suppose. We obviously have a slightly different preference on what makes for a good strategy game, but nonetheless, I hope this discussion was interesting for everybody listening in. One of the things we usually end with, and I think I know the answer to this already, but one of the things we usually end our series with is, given this is the Single Malt Strategy podcast, there is a adult beverage theme to it, and I believe you're just drinking water tonight, if I'm correct, Tortuga. But
tea.
Oh, tea. Okay. So, what is your? Do you drink alcohol?
Yeah, I actually put whiskey in my tea, so I still qualify.
Oh, really? You did put whiskey in your tea. What kind of whiskey?
The Maker's Mark. Yes. It's not necessarily the whiskey that you're going to taste as much, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a good one. But Maker's Mark is quite good. I actually enjoy it.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Yeah, Maker's Mark is a pretty good whiskey. I don't drink it a ton, but one of my really good friends, that's the whiskey he swears by. So I can definitely see you there. I personally am just drinking a little bit of Jack Daniels. So again, nothing special on my end, just kind of I think Maker's Mark is definitely better than Jack Daniels, but it's all I had in the cabinet today. So, nothing special or illuminating or worth really discussing, but I felt we'd be amiss if our logo has a whiskey glass and we didn't at least bring up, part of the title of our show.
So your drink of choice for tonight mirrored our conversation, right?
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? I'm not sure I'm following.
Oh, I was just joking. If you're saying that you didn't pick anything special and it was a kind of a bland drink, then here we are.
Tortuga, you're a very special YouTuber, and I don't want you to let any of the other kids tell you that you're not. You are special in your own way. I suppose we're kind of talking about nothing now.
Move on, yeah.
So, thank you for coming onto the show. Do you want to plug your channel, or I believe you're on a podcast yourself as well, right?
Yeah, I'm on the Forex podcast, so that's more Forex related stuff. I guess Stellaris would qualify. People who know some of the Paradox games might know that, but more so, I'd like to just spend the last moment just saying thank you. It was a real privilege to be on this with you, and it's too bad Gene couldn't make it because I think that it would have been more 2-on-1.
You're probably right, and maybe that would have made for a better show. But I enjoyed having you on, and it was an enjoyable discussion, and I hope other people found it interesting and maybe a little bit illuminating. But again, I just want to thank you for coming on. That'll wrap it up for episode 12 of the Single Malt Strategy podcast. And until next time, guys, thanks for tuning in. And until next time, we're out.